Vampires have had it rough. They used to be scary and go to raves until a certain special glittery boy came onto the scene and made them just downright suck. Before all that, back when vampires who were exposed to the sun would burn like a marshmallow under Peter's care, Konami put a stake in the ground with their very own vampire-centric franchise, Castlevania. Inspired by the old Universal monster movies from the 1930s, they crafted their own fangtastic, gothic masterpiece in video game form.
Starting out with an action platforming game, Castlevania has evolved numerous times since its original title, employing more RPG elements and pushing exploration over linear progression. It became partly responsible for the popularity and naming of the subgenre Metroidvania, a combination of Metroid and Castlevania. I suppose Castleroid just doesn't have quite the same ring to it. Sounds like a medieval disease. The franchise has even spawned a successful Netflix series, with a further spin-off planned. Unfortunately though, much like Metal Gear Solid, Konami has allowed the gaming side of the franchise to slowly dry up, making it unclear what's next for Castlevania. Okay, that's our last vampire pun, I swear. I do. Cross my heart and hope to die. Oh, sorry.
If you've not yet closed the video, let's go over the ground rules. We'll be ranking the games on a combination of critical reception, how well they stand the test of time, and a sprinkle of personal preference for good measure. This means if you disagree with any of our placements, we can chalk it up to a difference of opinion and laugh it off, right? As usual, we won't be including mobile games except for those that originated on another platform.
We'll also be excluding pachinko, slot, and patchy slot machines. Konami may not be able to help themselves, but we certainly can. Collections also won't be ranked, as we're already ranking the individual games separately. And finally, we'll only include ports of the same game as separate entries when the port is different enough to warrant its own spot on the list.
With all that out of the way and a spoiler warning throughout, let's sink our teeth in and rank 'em. I'm Ben.
And I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here is every Castlevania video game ranked from worst to best.
Number 36, Castlevania PC. We're kicking off our list with a port, and what a port! Following the success of the first Castlevania game for the Famicom Disk System and the Nintendo Entertainment System, Konami tasked Distinctive Software with the all-important job of translating the smash hit game for the PC market. Well, Distinctive Software must have used Google Translate, because the end result didn't resemble the original one bit. The plot is roughly the same as the OG Castlevania, but that's about as far as the similarities go. Look, we have to be fair to Distinctive Software. The relationship between consoles and PCs was very different back then. Nowadays, PCs are at the forefront of gaming architecture, with Microsoft and Sony always playing catch-up, but there was a time when home consoles were more advanced than the average home PC. This meant that developers would often have to downgrade a game in order for it to be playable on a wider range of graphics cards. However, it did not mean that they had to cut off the game's head, stuff it full of garlic, and toss it in a river. In this PC port, the atmosphere is completely butchered in favor of bright, wacky colors and cursed, painful music akin to TV static. The only new things that the PC port brought to the game were features such as visual stuttering, clunky animations, and unresponsive controls. Great! In fact, about the only thing the developers did get right was the soundtrack. If the game's audio is played through the correct ancient sound card, some of the noise scrambling disappears and leaves you with an adequate rendition of the classic Castlevania soundtrack. Considering that the original does everything better and doesn't make your eyes and ears bleed, we think this one is best left in the vaults. Number 35. Haunted Castle, Arcade and PS2. It may be low in the rankings, but Haunted Castle has the best opening to any Castlevania to date. The hero, Simon Belmont, is leaving a chapel after marrying a woman who we can only assume is Princess Peach. However, the wedding march is crudely interrupted as lightning strikes the chapel and Dracula swoops down from the clouds, abducting Simon's bride. The game then puts the player in control of Simon, who has shredded his tux to make an outfit that better displays his incredible biceps. Now that's storytelling! The graphics look great, and the music gets you in the mood to whip some ghoulies, so where does it all go wrong? Well, this is a game originally developed for the arcade and only ported to PS2 18 years later in Japan. This means that the game's true intention is to steal every single coin from your grubby little hands. The laziest way an arcade game can rob you blind is through artificial difficulty, and with a development cycle of only 6 months, Konami left no time to fine-tune this approach so as not to frustrate the player too much. Haunted Castle mercilessly beats players into the ground at every turn, and even refuses to reward them with health replenishment after beating each boss, unlike previous Castlevania games. Another franchise departure is that the fast, tricky enemies, like the Hunchback, now require 2 hits to kill instead of the usual 1. This results in cheap shots that can't be undone without a shiny penny once that game over screen starts to flash. The PS2 port did away with these issues by offering unlimited continues, but that's hardly a fix considering that other games in the franchise were able to limit continues due to better balancing, presenting more of a challenge without tipping over into frustration. There are other issues, such as slow movement that makes Simon look like he might be suffering from shin splints. Simon's bulky design is a bit out of place for this series, and it also means a larger hitbox, which results in even more of those cheap hits. The bosses in this game are also a little odd, such as a stained glass window man on a pogo stick, and the multiple semi-naked bosses that might be too racy for the YouTube police. There they are, sort of. They're a bit blurred, but they're there. There are many positive elements to Haunted Castle, but they're unfortunately outweighed and then crushed into oblivion by the brutal difficulty. Number 34. Castlevania Judgment. Wii. By 2008, Castlevania had well over 20 games under its belt, which spanned multiple time periods, characters, and storylines. If only there was a way to bring all those characters together to make something truly amazing. Okay, picture this, a scenario in which a great threat faces the planet and the only way to stop it is to hold a fighting tournament where heroes and villains engage in combat to the death in order to determine a champion. What do you mean you're picturing Mortal Kombat? No, this is Castlevania Judgment, thank you very much, completely different concept. Yes, this is a Castlevania fighting game released for the Nintendo Wii, and if you think that's silly, then you should hear the plot. A new character, Eon, scrambles to bring our favourite Castlevania heroes and villains through time and space to discover the greatest fighter and therefore the most capable of beating the Time Reaper, a servant of Galamoth. You know, Galamoth, the Lord of Space who plots to travel back in time to defeat his rival Dracula so he can change history? It's Galamoth, come on, it's Galamoth. If all of that sounds like nonsense to you, that's because this is a fighting game, so that's par for the course. Castlevania Judgment does boast an impressive roster of 14 fighters, including Dracula himself. The characters were designed by Takeshi Obata, known most famously for his art in the Death Note manga. Unfortunately, something was lost in the redesign process and the characters look great, but they don't quite look like Castlevania characters anymore. However, fighting games live and die by their gameplay, so how does Castlevania Judgment fare? Unfortunately, like a vampire at a baptism. One major issue is the implementation of the Wiimote, which will perplex players until they realize that they can treat it like a match of Wii Sports Tennis and wave the remote around until they develop a repetitive stress injury. Critics at the time of release complained about a lackluster story mode, terrible camera, annoying dialogue, and the absence of balancing, which allowed certain characters and moves to be game-breakingly overpowered. Developers Eighting did include a castle mode that tried to provide players with a more traditional Castlevania experience, but this wasn't fleshed out enough to make Castlevania Judgment worth the purchase. So, since the title of the game demands it, let's deliver Judgment. We find the defendant guilty of being a rubbish game and sentence it to death. Thank you very much. Number 33. Castlevania The Adventure. Game Boy. Set a century before the original Castlevania, Castlevania The Adventure follows Christopher Belmont, ancestor of Simon Belmont and wielder of the Vampire Killer Whip. It was the first Castlevania game to make its way to the Game Boy, and it followed the classic Castlevania route of progressing through Dracula's castle in order to reach and defeat him. Considered by some to be the worst Castlevania game ever, but obviously not by us, this title is frustrating, bland, and to some extent, broken. The excuse cannot be made that the game was hampered by the limited technology of the Game Boy, as we'll see other Game Boy Castlevania games higher on this list. Konami simply managed to copy the template of a Castlevania game without injecting any of the fun. Christopher himself walks as though he's wading through custard on an invisible cross-trainer, and to make matters worse, there's a time limit for each stage, which probably resulted in players screaming at their Game Boys for Christopher to get a move on and take things seriously. None of this is helped by boring level design and bland bland backgrounds that were lacking in detail by Game Boy standards. Even the enemies can be unconvincing, like this tennis ball throwing sock puppet thing. But the final nail in the coffin for Castlevania the Adventure is the difficulty. With the slow movement, it's incredibly easy to take hits, and some are simply unavoidable. The Vampire Killer Whip can be upgraded to a Chain Whip and then a Flame Whip, but taking one hit will downgrade the weapon as well as your patience. The music manages to make it out of the experience mostly unscathed. It doesn't sound its best coming from the small speakers of the Game Boy, but it's by no means a slouch. Although when it comes to Castlevania, or any game for that matter, a soundtrack that doesn't make your ears bleed is, quite frankly, the bare minimum players should expect. Number 32. Castlevania, Commodore 64. Here we are again, back at the start, and look, it's our old friends, Distinctive Software, the same developer that worked on the god-awful PC port of the original Castlevania, but this time they're porting it to the Commodore 64. Since we're now higher up on the list, Distinctive Software must have done a better job this time around. Well, the graphics are certainly improved, they're still much blockier than the original, but this time the player controls a distinct Roblox man instead of the blurry Breeze Block man from the PC version. But hey, an improvement is an improvement. The enemy sprites are still clunkier than the original, but at least now we can tell what they're supposed to be. Although the Commodore 64 port beats out the PC port when it comes to the visuals, its gameplay is almost as bad. The Commodore 64 only had the joystick and a single action button to control the game compared to the NES, which utilized 3. This meant that players had an attack button but no dedicated jump button. And to counteract this, pushing up on the joystick was used to jump. However, to throw a sub-weapon on the NES, players had to hold up on the D-pad and press attack. With up on the joystick now being used to jump, the Commodore 64 made the player hold down the attack button to throw a sub-weapon. This one design flaw artificially makes the game much harder due to the delay caused by having to hold a button rather than a quick press. As though it didn't make things hard enough, some enemies have slightly different attack patterns from the original, creating situations in which the player can't avoid taking a hit. Distinctive Software did seem to recognize their mistakes led to a higher level of difficulty as they added a save feature to the game that wasn't available in the NES version, but this feels somewhat akin to applying tea tree oil to a gunshot wound. Other than the save feature, Castlevania on the Commodore 64, much like the PC port, is a lesser experience by a wide margin. Unlike the PC port, this version manages to retain some of the spectacle and mood of the original, but it falls short of a fun experience. Fortunately for us, this was Distinctive Software's last experiment with the Castlevania franchise. Number 31. Castlevania the Arcade. Recently, we ranked another Konami franchise, Silent Hill, and within that list was a very odd and out-of-place light gun arcade shooter. Our main issue with Silent Hill Arcade was that the Silent Hill series was never about action and a quick trigger finger, making the arcade version feel forced and more like an exploitation of the Silent Hill name. Castlevania is a much more action-focused series, so could it work here? In short, not really, but for different reasons. The first concept to grapple with is the fact that this light gun shooter doesn't use a gun peripheral at all, but a mock whip. The whip has 2 buttons, one to activate the whip, if followed by a whipping motion, and the second to throw a sub-weapon such as a knife. The attempt to incorporate the franchise with the design of the arcade machine is admirable, even if the whipping motion is less precise and less enjoyable than aiming and shooting at the screen. If that's too off-putting, there are additional characters, such as the Lady Gunner, who use more traditional light gun mechanics. Unfortunately, this light gun shooter isn't immune to the arcade plague known as greed. Similar to other light gun titles like House of the Dead, there are numerous unavoidable hits that will chip away at your health and will ultimately gobble up your pocket money. Another common complaint is the short length of the game, as well as a lack of replay value beyond trying the other characters. As much as this arcade game mines the action roots of the Castlevania franchise, it's missing the joy of exploration that the series had become known for by the time of its release. Oh, and if you did want to check this one out despite its flaws, then good luck finding it, as it was released in Japan only and the number of playable machines is dwindling. Number 30. Castlevania Legends, Game Boy. Castlevania Legends is the third Castlevania release for the Game Boy, and we've already talked about the first. Unfortunately, however, Castlevania Legends takes its cues from that first release, as it's also not great. Legends is set sometime in the Middle Ages, positioned as an origin story of the Belmont clan's pact to forever hunt and destroy Dracula. That was until the game's plot was later declared non-canon by Konami in favor of a later game's alternate origin story. What fun. In this version, we follow Sonia Belmont, who, upon reaching her 17th birthday, begins to manifest mystical powers and decides to set out to Dracula's castle and use them to defeat him. She also bumps into series favourite Alucard along the way. As is usually the case with Castlevania, the plot is serviceable as a means to get us face to face with Dracula's army of the undead as quickly as possible. As soon as the game gets underway, the issues inherited from Castlevania the Adventure are obvious. Movement is painfully slow and the graphics are bland and unimaginative. Sonia can become faster, more powerful, and even invincible if the temporary burning mode is activated, though if the player is savvy enough to save this until they reach the mini-bosses, they can obliterate them in seconds, effectively reducing the game's difficulty to almost nothing. The first phase of the final battle with Dracula is trivial, and the less said about the second phase, the better. Okay, we have something to say. What is that? Arguably though, the biggest crime that Castlevania Legends committed was being released in the same year as Castlevania Symphony of the Night. While Legends tried to copy its predecessors in a mediocre fashion, Symphony of the Night innovated, transforming the Castlevania formula into something new and exciting. Legends ended up being such a letdown that longtime series producer Koji Igarashi labeled the game as an embarrassment for the series. Oof. Poor Sonia. No amount of blaze mode will protect her from that burn. Number 29. Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2, Xbox 360, PS3, and PC. Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2 is a direct continuation of Castlevania Lords of Shadow and Castlevania Lords of Shadow Mirror of Fate. Whoever thought to give the second game a subtitle with a colon and a hyphen and the third game the number 2 needs to have a long hard look at themselves. In a mirror. Oh, maybe that's how they came up with the name in the first place. Anyway, the Lords of Shadow trilogy is a set of 3D hack-and-slash games that vary in gameplay from one to the next. The story of Lords of Shadow 2 continues from the previous two games and even includes a recap, though the plot is even more dramatic, convoluted, and comical than what came before it. Let's just say it involves amnesia, deception, and Beelzebub himself, voiced by Jason Isaacs. You know, Lucius Malfoy and Field Marshal Zukov, among others. One benefit of the story is that it launches Gabriel Belmont, later known as Dracula, into more modern times, allowing the player to explore a new backdrop that has seldom been seen elsewhere in the Castlevania franchise. Not to mention that it gives players control of the series' great antagonist and all of his power. Players get a brief sniff of these possibilities at the start of the game before it goes on to commit one of the worst video game sins of all, giving players a full suite of powers at the start just to take them away and force them to slowly earn them back throughout the course of the game. Here's your fun, and now it's gone. The developers decided that after being stripped of his powers, it was a great time to make Dracula transform into a rat and hide from regular men in fear. This is the franchise's big bad we're talking about here. Yes, the Lords of Shadow trilogy attempted to humanize the Dark Lord of the Castlevania universe, so having players feel vulnerable in control of him could be narratively effective, if the stealth in this game wasn't the most tedious and painful experience possible. If we're really trying to find something positive here, we can applaud the developers for taking on fan feedback and removing QuickTime events, which were so prevalent in the first game. They also allowed players to move the camera this time, even if it was still awkward and stilted. Look, we're really trying here. Oh, did I mention Dracula can turn into a black fog thing to pass through bars? We nearly missed that one off our list. Get it? Yeah, you get it. Number 28. Castlevania 64. N64. We arrive now at the very first 3D Castlevania game. The Nintendo 64 saw a slew of classic titles make the jump from 2D to 3D. Think Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time. Okay, now unthink those and instead think of Earthworm Jim 3D and Donkey Kong 64. That's it, now we're in the right ballpark. Despite being 3D, Castlevania 64 has quite a lot in common with Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest. There are open areas for the player to explore, merchants to buy useful items from, and a day-night cycle that is incredibly infuriating. Some passageways or characters may only be available at certain times of the day, and some enemies can also be easier or harder to kill depending on whether it's day or night. To navigate these issues, players can either wait around and smell the flowers, wait, are those even flowers? Or they can use sun or moon cards to advance time. On paper this sounds interesting and inspires dreams of Majora's Mask style puzzles and gameplay, but in reality, considering that good or bad endings are dependent on how many in-game days you take to complete the title, this mechanic is too clunky and half-baked. But what about the amazing 3D gameplay? Well, when players boot up the game, they are given the choice of 2 playable characters: Reinhardt, the heir to the Belmont clan, and Annie, a singing orphan. Carrie, a magical orphan. If players don't pick Carrie, they're in for a hard knock life, as Reinhardt utilizes the series' famous whip, which translates to 3D horribly. A terrible camera and clunky controls make Carrie a better option since her magic attacks home in on enemies. Either way, players still have to tackle the many lengthy platforming sections while the camera shows them a very interesting bit of stonework that's off to the side and is just so amazing, you must see it. Luckily, there's an easy mode if the terrible camera makes the game feel too difficult, but be warned, in what is possibly the cruelest and most unusual rug pull ever concocted by game developers, players will be allowed to play through a large portion of the game in easy mode before they are presented with a message stating that it cannot be completed and the player must start again on normal mode to see the full game. Wow, Castlevania 64, just wow. It's not all doom and gloom though. Well, it is, which is on brand. Castlevania 64 really leans into the horror aspect that the franchise has been known to sometimes dilute. The early 3D graphics and sparse areas do add a desolate atmosphere that helps to build tension, just for said atmosphere to be ruined by Frankenstein's monster with a chainsaw for an arm and skeletons on motorbikes. What? The year's supposed to be 1853. Has Eon been meddling with his time machine again? Castlevania 64? More like, please sir, I don't want any more. Why can't I stop thinking of orphans? Number 27. Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, Famicom Disk System, and NES. Set directly after the events of the first Castlevania game, Simon's Quest follows, you guessed it, Simon, as he tries to rid himself of the curse set upon him by Dracula just before he was slain. Simon must collect Dracula's 5 scattered body parts across 5 different castles in order to break the curse. What exactly he's supposed to do once he has all 5, we're not quite sure. I suppose he has to piece them together like some kind of fleshy jigsaw? Simon's Quest has one major change from the first 2 Castlevania games that preceded it. Rather than a linear journey, players have more freedom to go anywhere they want. There are some light RPG elements too, such as leveling up and items that provide access to past areas that were previously inaccessible. If it sounds like I'm describing a Metroidvania game, that is because I am. This is the first game in the Castlevania franchise to take this route, and it was repeated and perfected by later Castlevania titles. You see, Nintendo's Metroid was released in 1986, the year before Simon's Quest, and included a very similar style of gameplay. Gameplay director Hitoshi Akamatsu denied that the game was inspired by Metroid, but instead by another Konami game, The Maze of Gallius, although The Maze of Gallius did still release after Metroid, so it's unclear where the game got its ideas from. Either way, being second or third person on the moon is still impressive, so we'll let Simon's Quest keep its pioneer status. The problem with being one of the first to do something, however, is that you could also be the first to do it wrong. Simon's Quest was the earliest Castlevania game to include a day-night cycle, with villagers only appearing during the day and monsters being stronger at night. There are also 3 endings, depending on how long you take to defeat Dracula. The most frustrating issue with this mechanic is that every 6 minutes a text box appears to indicate the transition from day to night that states, "What a horrible night to have a curse." This can be quite ominous when it happens for the first time, but the novelty wears off by the 10th, and after they've seen it for the 30th time, players begin to wonder whether the game itself is a curse. It doesn't help that gameplay has to come to a standstill for 10 long seconds every time this happens. At least that small irritation can be overlooked through Zen Master level self-discipline. What a Zen Master wouldn't be able to do is solve the impossible riddles given by the villagers in broken English that are vital to progress in the game. With all of that said, although Simon's Quest didn't quite hit the mark overall, it was an incredibly important step in the direction that would soon define Castlevania, and so we have to give it props for that, at least.
Number 26, Castlevania Amiga 500. No, still not the NES version, I'm afraid. Although the Amiga port did try desperately hard to be the NES version, and in our opinion, it's the port that came the closest. The game's graphics have been redesigned for the Amiga, and they're detailed and very clear. Though these enemies didn't come through the conversion quite so well. They just kind of look like regular people wearing purple sheets. But then to be fair, if somebody in the street ran at me with a purple sheet over their head, waving their arms around, I'd run. Oh, and Dracula has received a full makeover too. Instead of looking like the lesser-known fifth member of Kiss, he's now taken on the form of a troll doll on acid. We aren't trying to shame him though. I mean, giving himself a makeover is probably the only thing he has to occupy his time while he waits for Simon to slowly make his way through that giant castle. The Amiga port has the same unfortunate button mapping issue as its older brother, the Commodore 64, with the player having to hold the attack button to launch a sub-weapon. There's also a clear jittering as the levels scroll along with Simon, and the only way players might not have noticed this is if they'd been sat on an active washing machine while they played. The Amiga port also boasts similar changes to enemy movement as the Commodore 64 version, with some having slightly different patterns or increased speeds. This makes the game unnecessarily harder, and it wasn't a cakewalk to begin with. Thankfully, there is a save system though, so you can always return to where you left off to continue having your rear handed to you. The Amiga does improve on the Commodore 64 version's soundtrack, and some even argue that the music is as good, if not better, than that of the NES build. Now that is a bold claim, and it ultimately comes down to personal preference. Either way, the music alone isn't enough reason to go for the Amiga version over the NES, and the redesigned graphics lose some of their mystique in the conversion. That, coupled with the artificial difficulty, leads us to point you in the direction of the original, but the Amiga port was a worthy contender indeed. You could even say that it wasn't a meager effort. I won't be saying that though, and I will instead be firing the writer. Number 25, Castlevania Dracula X, SNES. Here's a fun fact, Castlevania Dracula X, not Dracula 10, is known as Castlevania Vampire's Kiss in Europe. Does that mean that the X in Dracula X is meant to be a little kiss? We'll leave you to be the judge of that, but we're saying it very much is. Kiss kiss. Anyway, Dracula X is some sort of port of Castlevania Rondo of Blood, which was released 2 years earlier in Japan only. We say sort of because it's a shadow of its former self. Due to an exclusivity deal, Rondo of Blood couldn't be copied and pasted directly across to the SNES. Rather than mix up the levels, change the bosses, or replace the two playable characters with new ones though, Konami decided that the best way to alter the game was to simply remove content. Granted, the SNES itself also introduced hardware limitations, but fans did expect a like-for-like port. The graphics are mostly the same, but there are fewer levels, only one playable character instead of two, and the 8-way attack scheme is pared back to only 4. Another major setback was the removal of branching levels in favour of a more linear design that aged this title back to the NES era. Castlevania as a whole was moving in a new direction and was expanded upon even further in the release that followed Dracula X, but sadly Dracula X itself sat awkwardly in the past and was already dated upon its release. The game is also harder than its counterpart due to the previously mentioned limited attack directions, as well as enemies executing follow-up attacks too quickly after hitting the player, effectively stun-locking them. A 2.5D collection titled Castlevania The Dracula X Chronicles was released in 2007 for the PlayStation Portable, but this is a remake of Rondo of Blood and not a remake of Dracula X. Now, when Castlevania fans hear Dracula X, they can think fondly of the PSP collection, rather than endure horrific flashbacks of the SNES title. It's no surprise, really, that Castlevania Dracula X is commonly labelled as one of the biggest disappointments in Castlevania's repertoire. It's far from the worst Castlevania game, but given the material that Konami started with, Western audiences expected much, much more. Number 24, Kid Dracula, Famicom Disk System. Kid Dracula is not Dracula as a child. He's actually Dracula's spawn, which would presumably make him Alucard. I don't know. He was such a 90s kid though, look at that gelled hair. Or he's just one fruit winder away from asking his mum for frosted tips. But hang on, I hear you cry. I thought vampires didn't age. How did Alucard grow to become so tall and handsome? we assume it's probably something to do with the fact that Alucard is only half vampire, though we'll be damned if we can find anything in Kid Dracula that actually confirms this. Anyway, I digress. Kid Dracula was released for the Famicom as a parody of Castlevania, but the gameplay is actually more in line with the likes of Mega Man. The player must make their way through stages, defeating enemies as they go, to reach an end-level boss and earn a power-up that can be used for the rest of the game. The demon Galamoth has declared himself Demon King, a title held by Kid Dracula until he hibernated for too long. You know what they say, you snooze, you lose. The aim then is to beat the demons that have taken Galamoth's side and reclaim the title. There's very little plot delivered in the game though, with the focus primarily being on gameplay. Despite its cute appearance, Kid Dracula ramps the difficulty up after the first few levels, and can be quite frustrating as you get further into the game, partly due to Kid Dracula's huge sprite that takes up far too much of the screen. That being said, there is a lot to love here. The music is on par with other Castlevania titles, there's plenty of level variety, and there are some really creative bosses. One level has players running across the roof of a train while being attacked by Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th, only to then go toe-to-toe with Lady Liberty. Okay. This title is remembered so fondly that it's earned itself hidden gem status amongst fans who actually know it exists. It also received a port to Nintendo's Game Boy, but more on that in a bit. Number 23, Castlevania Harmony of Despair, PlayStation Network and Xbox Live Arcade. Not to be confused with Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance, Harmony of Despair is a multiplayer Castlevania game released exclusively for the PlayStation and Xbox digital platforms. But why did it not see a physical release? Is it because it's bad? Well, yes, sort of, but also because the gameplay relies heavily on having 2 or more players. The game allows up to 6 participants to get in on the fun, either online or through local play, the latter being something of a rarity nowadays. It plays similarly to boss rush modes of previous Castlevania titles, where players race through a level defeating enemies to reach the final boss as quickly as possible. There are multiple playable characters and a leveling system, but no overarching plot or huge intermingled map, just smaller spaces with a focus on exciting monster slaying with pals. A versus mode is also available for those who'd rather take out their frustrations on a friend. But what if you're like us and don't really have any friends? Well, there's not much for you here, I'm afraid. Harmony of Despair is playable solo, but without the manic multiplayer, it's a pretty boring and empty experience, and it becomes quickly apparent that the core of the game was built around buddies. Some shortcuts in certain maps require at least 2 people to access, so it's the long way round for singletons. And even with friends, the content is fairly threadbare, unless players enjoy replaying the same maps to grind XP or to beat their high score. It feels like Harmony of Despair was made for series veterans who longed for a fully fleshed out multiplayer experience. What players ended up with was something certainly more extensive than previous multiplayer attempts, but still very much lacking. At least the price reflects this though, as it can be purchased currently for less than the cost of a greasy takeaway. It's probably slightly healthier too. Number 22, Castlevania Legacy of Darkness, N64. Castlevania Legacy of Darkness was released in the same year as Castlevania 64 and sold as an expanded version of said 64-bit title. The reason for the close release window was because Konami rushed the development of Castlevania 64 and had to cut unfinished content at the last minute. As such, Legacy of Darkness benefited from 2 new playable characters, improved graphics, reworked levels, and a few new bosses. See kids, game developers have been releasing games in an unfinished state long before downloading patches was a thing. The difference between now and then is that Konami had to release a whole new game to incorporate all the features that were missing. Critics were naturally unimpressed by this, and gave Legacy of Darkness a lower score on average than Castlevania 64 itself, citing that Legacy of Darkness was what Castlevania 64 should have been on release. However, in retrospect, it seems unfair to rank the game lower than its predecessor, since it's mostly the same game but with a few improvements and more stuff. If we had to pick one to play now, we certainly wouldn't pick the unfinished game just because it came first. The story in Legacy of Darkness begins before the plot of Castlevania 64. Players control Cornell, a man-beast capable of switching between human and wolf form, on his journey to rescue his adoptive sister, Ada. When it comes to combat, Cornell's lock-on is possibly even worse than Reinhardt's, which is truly saying something. Players will have to struggle through though, as the other characters aren't unlocked in the game until it's been completed with the Beastie Boy. This does make sense from a narrative standpoint because Cornell's story is a prequel, but it doesn't make for a very good time. All in all, Legacy of Darkness is a more complete Castlevania package, even if it maintains most of the issues that Castlevania 64 had. Some might argue that those issues are so severe that having an additional 2 characters to replay the story with is actually a negative. However, since nobody is being forced to complete the game while strapped to some sort of torture device, we've placed this one higher. The only person in any immediate danger is our writer. We won't let him leave until he's finished ranking everything that's ever existed. Number 21. Castlevania Lords of Shadow Mirror of Fate. 3DS, PS3, Xbox 360, and PC. Following the generally positive reception of Lords of Shadow, developer Mercury Steam decided to fill the gap between it and the next numbered Lords of Shadow sequel with a game that was much smaller in scope. Mirror of Fate was a hybrid of new and old, returning to a more Metroidvania style of side-scrolling gameplay with elements of the button-mashing combat found in Lords of Shadow. The offspring of this strange courtship isn't terrible, but it's still far from perfect. The story continues from Lords of Shadow, but this time players have the opportunity to play as 4 different characters, each bringing a bit of variety to the gameplay. Simon throws axes and can summon familiars, Alucard can turn into a wolf and breathe underwater, Gabriel wields a whip like in the previous game, and Trevor utilizes magic and can do a double jump. No, sorry, I can't say that, we can't afford the legal fees. Unlike other Castlevania games though, the player doesn't choose a character from the start, but rather the playable character changes as the story progresses. Sadly, this actually works against the game, since players barely have enough time to settle into a character before they're whisked away to the next one. Like in the previous game, combat depth comes from combos, and it still feels satisfying when translated into a 2D perspective. What Mirror of Fate doesn't get right though is something that had become a core tenet of these side-scrolling Castlevania games: exploration. There is no large interconnected map this time around, but instead chapters with mostly linear progression. Once a chapter is cleared, there's no backtracking to that area, which doesn't incentivize players to do anything other than keep pushing right. This is a huge oversight, and Mirror of Fate winds up feeling far hollower because of it. Adding to this feeling is the difficulty, or lack thereof. Button mashing tends to get the job done in most cases, and if you do come across a particularly tricky boss and die, don't worry because you'll respawn right back into the fight with progressively more and more health until you come out on top. Because of all this, it's hard to deny that Mirror of Fate felt like a disposable title to fill the void between the 2 numbered games in the trilogy. Number 20. Castlevania Chronicles, Sharp X68000 and PlayStation. What on earth is the Sharp X68000, I hear you cry? Well, I'm not telling you. Okay, I will. The Sharp X68000 was a home computer only released in Japan. It was a popular choice for playing video games, as a lot of the hardware in the X68000 was similar to the tech in arcade cabinets at the time, and Konami saw this as a great opportunity for a modern take on the original Castlevania with better graphics. This was called Castlevania Chronicles. This game is a remake, not a remaster. Aside from the reworked art and sprites, there are new stages, areas taken from the original game and altered to make them feel fresh, new music, multiple playthrough options with higher difficulties, and a time trial mode. Castlevania Chronicles was also ported to the PlayStation, where the graphics were slightly better and new intro and ending renders were added, but that's about as far as the differences go, hence them being bundled into one entry. Castlevania as a franchise has always struggled to find the right balance when it comes to difficulty, but Castlevania Chronicles tips the scale in the wrong direction. Firstly, despite all the improvements from the original, very few of its issues are addressed in this remake. The knockback when the player is hit is still severe, but what's worse is that Castlevania Chronicles introduces new levels that make this an even bigger issue. You only have to look at the raft stage to understand what we mean. Honestly, if Simon still doesn't know how to swim at this point, then he probably deserves to drown. This game is set centuries ago. What else was there to do that kept him too busy to learn to swim? Oh, was he too busy farming and making everything from scratch? Oh yeah, he probably was. Okay, fair enough. The main thing Castlevania Chronicles set out to do was to create a newer, more accessible version of the original Castlevania for fans and new players alike to enjoy. Did it succeed in replacing the original? We don't think so. It certainly did a better job at emulating the OG Castlevania than all the ports did, but Castlevania Chronicles fails both to replicate the feel of the original and improve upon its flaws. It is different enough to stand on its own though, and because of this, it's hard not to recommend it to fans of the series. Number 19. Castlevania, Famicom Disk System and NES. We've finally made it to the best version of the original Castlevania. First released for the Famicom Disk System in 1986 and quickly ported to the NES a year later, the NES version is almost identical to the original, unlike the other ports. You know the narrative of the game by now, so let's just talk about why this is the best way to play the first Castlevania. Not many horror games existed back in the mid-1980s, unless you count Ghosts and Goblins, which took more of a wacky approach. Konami then tried their hardest to create an unsettling atmosphere by pulling from the horror classics, inspiring Castlevania's incredible backdrops and enemies. Additionally, Castlevania boasts a map showing Simon's progression through the castle, and the spire where Dracula sleeps can even be seen in the background earlier in the game, a style of level design that went on to inspire the likes of Dark Souls decades later. The soundtrack is also one of the best on the NES, though considering that back in the day, many games were content with 20-second loops to cover an entire game, that might not actually be saying much. Combat is simple, but it's kept exciting thanks to the sub-weapons, which would continue to be a franchise staple. Simon can throw knives, axes, holy water, and a sacred cross, which is essentially a boomerang. Players can only carry one at a time though, which doesn't really make sense. Couldn't he just attach them all to his belt or something? Additionally, Simon can utilise a magic watch to freeze time, which is giving us some serious 90s British kids TV flashbacks. Bernard's watch, anyone? No? Okay, fair enough. However, Castlevania is far from perfect, which is why it isn't number one in the list, you silly goose. Delete that comment. When hit by an enemy, Simon is thrown backwards, which was quite common amongst games at the time, yes, but given that this game has a large platforming element, players will often fall to their death. Stairs also appear to confuse Simon, as he can't jump off them and he walks up and down them at a near glacial pace, which is another source of easy hits for your enemies. With that said though, the Famicom version does have an easy mode, and the NES build has infinite continues if you need a helping hand. Castlevania is the one that started it all, and its influence can be seen both in more recent Castlevania games and in other popular titles across the medium. It's certainly showing its age now though, and if Konami has taught us anything, it's that the original Castlevania should be remembered fondly, but probably left firmly in the past. Number 18. Castlevania Curse of Darkness, PS2 and Xbox. Following Castlevania 64, Konami made numerous other attempts at capturing the same success in 3D that Castlevania had managed to find in its 2D games. Curse of Darkness focuses on Hector, a devil forge master who previously worked for Dracula, who decides he wants to settle down for a normal life with his wife. Aw, that's cute. Then Isaac, his fellow forge master, has Hector's wife burnt alive. Not so cute. Understandably, Hector seeks revenge, chasing Isaac across Europe. The story is typically melodramatic for the franchise, but it does its job of engrossing the player for the game's full runtime. Also, fans of the Netflix series will see influences taken from Curse of Darkness's narrative. Combat falls into the hack and slash category, with one button dedicated to standard attacks and a second dedicated to special finishes. Since he isn't a Belmont, Hector has access to a variety of weapons, including a Gatling gun. We must take this opportunity to remind you that this game is set in 1479. And while we're on the subject, French fries and burgers for healing items? Whatever happened to hearts? A burger's more likely to give you a heart attack. And yeah, alright, eating meat with bread probably had been invented in 1479, but burgers? No, I'm putting my foot down, this shouldn't be allowed. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. Hector, being a Devil Forge master, brings another unique spin to the combat with his innocent devils, which are familiars he can summon to help him fight or solve puzzles. This was a welcome change to separate Hector from the standard Castlevania hero, but for fans of the classic playstyle, Trevor Belmont is also unlocked in extra modes following the main game. Curse of Darkness saw the series taking a huge step in the right direction, giving players maps that are large and interconnected, unlike previous 3D Castlevania games that were segmented into levels. One thing Konami couldn't work out though was how to make use of the 3D space. Corridors are bland and empty, and fog looms ahead of the player to disguise the short draw distance. The combat carries the game though, along with some fun voice acting, an impressive opening cinematic, and a Star Wars-style text crawl at the start, so it is worth a try if you can appreciate the cornier side of Castlevania and push past the flaws. Number 17, Vampire Killer, MSX2. Vampire Killer, qu'est-ce que c'est, is the black sheep of the Castlevania franchise. That's the game we're talking about, not the Belmont's whip. It was developed and released alongside the original Castlevania game, but it was the first of the pair to be localized in Europe. The Castlevania name didn't exist until the OG Castlevania made its way to the West after Vampire Killer's release. Strangely, it even has the same plot as the original Castlevania, but with entirely new levels and a different style of gameplay. Firstly, Vampire Killer isn't quite as linear, and it's the first game in the franchise to use exploration as a gameplay mechanic. Simon must hunt around maze-like levels in order to find a way out, as well as a skeleton key to unlock the exit. I don't know why there's so many keys lying around. I guess Dracula's dropping them on a daily basis. Oh, I bet his locksmith's absolutely loaded. The keys are easy to find at first, but as players progress through the game, the levels become more complex and they become more difficult to find. Merchants can be found throughout the levels, and they sell items such as health potions and sub-weapons. Players have to keep their eyes peeled, as some of the keys or merchants hide behind rock walls. It's no wonder you're going out of business when you've set up shop inside Dracula's castle, behind a rock wall, guarded by monsters with no signage, you fool. The knockback issue from early Castlevania games is very much present, and with no continues, Vampire Killer can be very tricky to see through. Some critics also complain that the level design can be too confusing at times, causing them to get lost. Upon death, players also lose all of their equipment other than their hearts, which seems a bit excessive. Despite these issues though, it's easy to see in Vampire Killer all of the innovation that the franchise would later become known for. The graphics have even more detail than the original Castlevania, and with the added depth that the new level designs bring to the formula, it just edges out the original game, in our opinion. And if you still aren't persuaded, just look how cool this game's version of the final Dracula fight looks. We too have giant portraits of ourselves at TripleJump Towers, just so we can always have our eyes looming over James. And since we installed them, his editing proficiency has gone up 200%. Ben will tell you.
Number 16. Kid Dracula, Game Boy. Kid Dracula 1993 is part remake and part sequel to Kid Dracula 1990. This time around, there's a slightly more fleshed out plot told through dialogue boxes. Galamoth, mistakenly called Garamoth in the game, is back again. So Kid Dracula sets out to defeat him with help from his companion, Death. Surprisingly, Death is a great friend as he provides Kid Dracula with heirlooms that helps him on his journey. What a lovely being. In order to reset the slate from the previous game, Death scolds Kid Dracula for forgetting all of the spells he learned in his last adventure, meaning he'll have to learn them all over again. We have to hand it to them, this is a funny way of traversing a common gaming cliche. Funnily enough, the lazy amnesia plot device that it's mocking is used in later Castlevania games a comical number of times. Now that's ironic, don't you think? In this game, some levels are reused from Kid Dracula's Famicom counterpart, as well as a few of the enemies and bosses, but there is plenty of new content for players to be able to enjoy both games independently. Unfortunately, the Game Boy version does still have the same issues, with Kid Dracula's sprite being far too large for the screen and the difficulty still ramps up too quickly, but despite that, however, this one is generally considered to be the easier of the two games. The added story elements help to create a more complete package than the one available on the Famicom. The Game Boy graphics may not be in color, but they're far more impressive than most other Castlevania Game Boy titles, which, remember, look terrible. Since it's a niche but well-respected title, Kid Dracula for Game Boy can be a bit on the pricey side. It was included in a Castlevania Anniversary collection, but unfortunately that was a port of the Famicom release. Kid Dracula didn't have much of a future in the Castlevania franchise, with it being an of-the-moment spin-off, but we're glad for the brief time we did get to spend with it. Number 15. Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth. WiiWare. Castlevania The Adventure scarred many fans of the series, making them wish they could forget it ever existed. Imagine their surprise then when Konami invited it to rear its ugly head once more in the form of a remaster for the Wii's digital store. Thankfully, Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth is more of a reimagining of the original game and was developed by M2, the people behind similar remasters Contra Rebirth and Gradius Rebirth. At a glance, you'd be forgiven for mistaking The Adventure Rebirth for a different game entirely, as the sprites, enemies, and environments are completely redrawn and now in color. In short, you can now actually tell what things are supposed to be. Hooray! The remake also introduces the typical sub-weapons from the Castlevania franchise, which weren't in the original, and adds the missing element to the combat that was previously lacking. Going above and beyond, M2 also redesigned the levels, improved playability by allowing movement while mid-jump, and increased Christopher Belmont's walking speed. It's nice to see him finally free of all of that custard. The difficulty has been rightly adjusted in the remaster, resulting in a perfectly balanced challenge. Taking hits no longer downgrades Christopher's whip, and the better jump controls and the easy mode make for a more friendly experience overall. One area that did bother critics was the soundtrack. Castlevania The Adventure features a mix of classic Castlevania tracks, but none are from the original game. This feels like a huge oversight, as the original soundtrack had a lot of potential and could have been rebirthed just as well as the rest of the game. M2 didn't push the metaphorical envelope of the Castlevania series, but they clearly poured a lot of passion and care into a game that was lost and forgotten, and managed to create something new that felt pleasantly retro. Number 14. Castlevania Lament of Innocence. PS2. Vampire origin stories aren't always brilliant. Let's see, there's Morbius, and there's Dracula Untold. Yikes. Castlevania had Castlevania Legends, which was also rather naff, actually. Thankfully, in 2003, Konami decided to have another pop at telling the origin of the Belmont and Dracula feud, completely blasting Castlevania Legends out into the non-canon sphere. Lament of Innocence follows Leon, no, not that one, Belmont, who sets out to save his fiancée Sarah, who is being held by a vampire called Walter. Leon receives help from an alchemist called Ronaldo, no, not that one, who gives him a whip to defeat the monsters in his way. Leon learns of a special stone from another vampire called Joachim that might grant Walter the ability to convert Sarah's essence into power once he's turned her into a vampire, and the plot is incredibly melodramatic, and it ultimately concludes with the birth of a century-spanning spat. Can't we all just shake hands and get along, boys? Come on! Lament of Innocence was released the year before Curse of Darkness, which made it the first 3D Castlevania game since Castlevania 64 and The Legacy of Darkness on the N64. The technology had come leaps and bounds in that 4-year interval, and this could be felt in most aspects of the game, except maybe the camera, which still made platforming in a 3D space a nightmare. One large area of improvement is in the combat, which adopted a hack-and-slash approach with a satisfying parry mechanic. There are also elemental whips, sub-weapons, and magic attacks to mix things up and add some depth. The biggest letdown, which Curse of Darkness would later correct, was the loss of a large explorable interconnected map that was proving successful in the 2D Castlevania games of the time. Leon starts at the entrance to Walter's castle and must go through 5 portals that lead to 5 segmented areas, and must defeat that area's boss before he can return. Once all 5 bosses are defeated, Leon can then enter the castle. This linear approach feels more in line with the older Castlevania titles, and by this point players expected more. Despite this, Lament of Innocence does still manage to be more enjoyable from a gameplay standpoint than Curse of Darkness. Also, regardless of the short duration, there's plenty of unlockable content to keep players busy. Is Leon too boring for you? you, perhaps you'd rather play as Sackboy with a pumpkin on his head. We're not sure why you'd want to, but you can do just that. We don't judge. There he is. Number 13. Super Castlevania 4. SNES. Despite being the 4th numbered Castlevania game, Super Castlevania 4 appears to be another remake of the OG Castlevania, as Simon Belmont players make their way through Dracula's castle to... Yeah, you've heard it a million times by now. To anyone who started a drinking game where you take a shot each time we've described a bare-bones plot that involved finding and killing Dracula, we hope you recover swiftly from having your stomach pumped. The setup is the same as the original Castlevania, so it's basically Castlevania Chronicles, but better! The visuals are deliciously crunchy, the music is rich and creamy, and the rhubarb filling is absolute... Sorry, I'll finish that later. The levels are completely remade, and they're extremely varied in terms of visuals and playstyle. Some have the player avoiding spike traps, whereas others will see them swinging from hooks or traversing spinning cogs. The SNES allowed developers to use a graphics style called Mode 7, which meant the backgrounds could be rotated to simulate a 3D environment. Therefore, some levels challenged the player's platforming skills as well as their ability to hold in the contents of their stomach. Dear God, get it off the screen, please! Thankfully, this throwback to the first Castlevania benefits from more modern improvements, such as the 8-way directional attacks and the ability to change trajectory while jumping. Still, it wouldn't be a classic Castlevania title without the exaggerated knockback when taking a hit. Konami, why must you make us suffer? Critics rated the game rather highly upon release. Some felt conflicted by the game's backstep from the branching levels in Dracula's Curse, but many agreed that Super Castlevania 4 had perfected the classic Castlevania formula. If players want to experience said perfection for themselves, this is the game we'd recommend over the original, as well as any of its ports and remakes. Number 12. Castlevania Bloodlines. Sega Genesis. Castlevania Bloodlines is something of a departure from the classic Castlevania plot formula, as it follows John Morris, the son of Quincy Morris, instead of one of the Belmont clan. Quincy Morris is actually a character from the original vampire novel Bram Stoker's Dracula, but who cares? Books are for nerds! John is accompanied by his friend Eric Lacard to stop a vampire called Elizabeth who has orchestrated the events leading to World War I, intending it to be a sacrificial war to resurrect Dracula. I don't remember learning about her at school, but if I'd known history was this interesting, I wouldn't have spent every lesson drawing Wilsons on every surface within arm's reach. Bloodlines was different from the series at the time, as it had more of a modern setting and a larger focus on quicker, more action-heavy combat. Players have the choice of playing as John or Eric, with each utilizing a unique playstyle and different paths throughout the game. John has the ability to swing across gaps using his whip, which Eric cannot traverse, while Eric can use his spear to perform high jumps and reach ledges out of John's reach. This allows branching paths that encourage multiple playthroughs. Additionally, Michiru Yamane made her Castlevania debut in this title as the game's composer, and following their success, went on to compose music for many more Castlevania titles. The problem with Bloodlines' attempts at being different to the previous games in the series, however, is that it ends up feeling like another franchise aping Castlevania. The colors across the game are too bright and garish, which makes it feel more cartoonish than dark and creepy. Additionally, the final fight with Dracula and his angry, toothy crotch seem like a Lovecraftian cosmic nightmare, which isn't necessarily a bad thing if that's what you're into, but it's certainly not Castlevania. Bloodlines never quite finds a personality of its own, so it's left feeling like something between a Castlevania spin-off and a rip-off. Regardless, if you can look past these discrepancies, the fast-paced, responsive action is more than enough of a reason to check this one out. Number 11. Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge. Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Yes, Belmont's Revenge is another Game Boy game. Yes, it's the sequel to Castlevania The Adventure, but before you run for the hills, this one's actually good. Sandwiched between an awful game and a slightly less awful game, Belmont's Revenge manages to hit all the points that make for a good Castlevania title. Set 15 years after The Adventure, Dracula's back again, this time kidnapping Christopher's son Soleil. At this point, we've stopped feeling sorry for Dracula for being hounded by generations of whip-wielding psychopaths, because he absolutely brings it upon himself. Dracula turns Soleil into a demon by utilizing Soleil's new coming-of-age powers, allowing the big bad to take on a human form and rebuild his castle once more. Christopher sets out to find and kill Dracula, and take another shot if you're playing that drinking game. From the offset, Christopher can travel to any one of 4 castles with different themes: cloud, plant, rock, and crystal. You know, the 4 elements. This immediately gives Belmont's Revenge more variety in its level design than the previous Game Boy title, and the environment environments are more detailed too, despite sharing the same hardware. Some rooms will even turn pitch black if the player smashes the on-screen candles, making them choose between visibility and the items that the candle might drop. One downside of allowing players to access any of the 4 castles from the start is that the difficulty can't curve naturally. Instead, the 4 castles are roughly as tough to best as each other, but once those are cleared, players unlock Dracula's castle, and its sudden difficulty spike is tricky to overcome. Also, the boss fight against the demon version of Soleil is a lesson in frustration. He doesn't react when hit, meaning he can just tank damage and spam attacks at you. Soleil, more like go away. I mean it, son, I'm disowning you. There are other minor improvements to gameplay in Belmont's Revenge that make all the difference. Firstly, Christopher is still slow, but he's faster and snappier to control than he was in The Adventure. He now also has access to the typical series sub-weapons, and his whip won't degrade from touching enemies like it used to. Belmont's Revenge is a simplistic Castlevania experience, but the game knows what it is and executes its scope admirably, making it the very best Castlevania for the Game Boy. Number 10. Castlevania Lords of Shadow. Xbox 360, PS3, and PC. The people at Konami have an unfortunate and rare condition where their skin breaks out in hives and their hair starts to fall out unless they reboot Dracula's origin story once every 5 years or so. The cure for this ailment in 2010 was Castlevania Lords of Shadow. This time, Konami wanted a full reboot of the franchise, gameplay and all, so they put it in the hands of Mercury Steam, a Spanish game developer who would later co-develop Metroid Dread for the Nintendo Switch. The story follows Gabriel Belmont, a member of the Brotherhood of Light, in his journey to stop the Lords of Shadow from threatening the alliance between Earth and the heavens. Look, we said it was a reboot, but we never said the plot was going to be coherent. The story, however, is bolstered by the voice acting talents of Robert Carlyle and Sir Patrick Stewart, which is enough to distract anyone for long enough to allow for such an overly dramatic plot. Lords of Shadow is the only 3D Castlevania game to crack this video's top 10, which says a lot about what Castlevania does best, but this is by no means a throwaway title. Yes, the game did borrow from other popular hack-and-slash games of the time, such as God of War, but it's still an engaging and solid entry. Players use a whip to attack, of course, and also have throwable sub-weapons, just like in the 2D games. Gabriel additionally has access to light and shadow magic, the former of which is defensive, while the latter surrounds Gabriel with a red aura and increases his damage output. Destroyed enemies drop XP, which allows you to level up and grants access to unlockable combos that can be worked into attacks. Critics enjoyed the combat overall, but didn't give Lords of Shadow any praise for its use of QuickTime events, which was considered old hat even in 2010. That said though, the game was reviewed very favourably overall. It's just a shame that it would be diminishing returns for the Lords of Shadow offshoot from here on out.
Number 9. Castlevania Order of Ecclesia, DS. Order of Ecclesia was the last Nintendo DS Castlevania title, but it's the first to appear on this list, proving that Castlevania DS games just do not miss. Set in the 1800s, the game takes place after Symphony of the Night and following the disappearance of the Belmont clan. This leaves nobody to defend the world against Dracula, so the titular Order of Ecclesia is formed in their stead. The main character, Shanoa, is a special member of the Order, tasked with being the vessel for a triad of magical glyphs called Dominus, which are based on Dracula's power. They end up stolen, and Shanoa loses her memory and must try to get them back. Classic hijinks. It does have some twists and turns later in the plot, which becomes standard for Castlevania games by this point in the franchise, and critics lauded the title for featuring such a strong female character as its protagonist. They were, however, less enthused by the terrible voice acting that was on offer. The main difference in this title is the glyph system, which is a rework of the tactical soul system from previous games. Players earn glyphs by defeating enemies or completing challenges, and can equip up to 2 at a time, with the powers consuming MP when used and allowing Shanoa to perform special moves or attacks. There's also a glyph union move that combines the powers of the 2 equipped glyphs, creating unique results. With over 100 glyphs available, the huge number of possible combinations offers players plenty of opportunity to experiment and makes the game highly replayable. Strangely though, Konami decided not to have the game take place in one large interconnected map, which worked extremely well in the previous DS titles, and instead decided to go for a Super Mario World style map. Critics also noticed that the structure of some areas were copied and pasted elsewhere in the game with different backdrops. Oh, naughty naughty. Order of Ecclesia is still a brilliant game though, and is definitely worthy of your time. However, if you're very conscious of the constant ticking of the clock and the looming bony hand of death grasping at your collar, then there are better DS Castlevania titles to try. Number 8. Castlevania Portrait of Ruin, DS. Speaking of better DS titles, Portrait of Ruin is both the second Nintendo DS Castlevania game and the second best, in our opinion. It's set after Castlevania Bloodlines and follows John Morris's son, Jonathan Morris, and Charlotte Orlin, a descendant of the Belnades clan. 3 vampires are out to recreate Dracula's castle, and they must be stopped. Portrait of Ruin has a very unique premise, in that the lead vampire is Browner, a character based on the Romanian artist Victor Browner. In Portrait of Ruin, he uses his paintings to create pocket dimensions to help power the castle. Players traverse through these paintings throughout their journey, which makes a nice change from the usual castle setting, as by this point in the franchise, the Stony Keep locale had been done to death. I mean, it is literally called Castlevania. If you're thinking, oh boy, Jonathan looks real cool with his anime hair and nice red jacket, but Charlotte seems really powerful with all that magic, which one should I choose? Then fear not, you don't have to pick. Players can actively switch between them on the fly to opt for the most suitable character in the moment. Their powers can even be combined in a devastating attack called the Jewel Crush, which, while admittedly extremely rad, does make some of the bosses a little too easy if you spam them with the old power of friendship. There's plenty of additional content outside of the main story too. There are 155 enemies to discover and track in the bestiary, 2 endings to achieve, and a boss rush mode with co-op. You can also replay the game in Richter mode as Richter Belmont and Maria Renard, or in Sister mode as Loretta and Stella Lacarde, the 2 vampire daughters of antagonist Browner. The latter mode is controlled in its entirety with the Nintendo DS stylus, which is a nice change up, but thankfully it's only this additional gameplay mode that uses this scheme. We can't imagine having to slog through the entirety of the main story with a stylus. Critics rated the game very highly, but many thought the dual character mechanic could have been explored further, and a better co-op mode should have been implemented. Regardless, Portrait of Ruin is still an excellent entry in the franchise, and demonstrates a great deal of creativity on Konami's part. Remember when they were capable of that? It's been a while. Number 7. Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance, Game Boy Advance. Harmony of Dissonance had the difficult job of following Castlevania Circle of the Moon on the Game Boy Advance, an incredibly well-reviewed game from the year before. Rather than trying to emulate Circle of the Moon's success, however, Konami decided to continue innovating upon the Metroidvania subgenre. Harmony of Dissonance features a 2-layered castle, Castle A and Castle B. Each is structurally the same, but the enemies and item placements are shifted, plus some puzzles require clever switching between the two in order to solve them. The game is set in 1748, 50 years after Simon's quest. Players control the grandson of Simon named Players control Belmont as he tries to recover a kidnapped childhood friend with the help of another friend, Maxime. Maxime has lost his memory, but he remembers facing off against Dracula just before his memory was wiped. Maxime seems to be causing the castle's dual personality, and his mental state fluctuates throughout the game. We've played enough Castlevania games to see where this one's going. Despite the amnesiac cliché, critics found the story compelling, if at times confusing. Something that divided reviewers, however, were the graphics. Despite the game's predecessor, Circle of the Moon, being well received, a common complaint was that the game was far too dark, making it difficult at times to tell what was happening. Konami heard that complaint loud and clear, turning that saturation dial up to 11. Some critics found that the rich, almost neon colours of Harmony of Dissonance brought a new style to the franchise, whereas others considered them to be too gaudy and something of an overcorrection. One thing's for sure though, nobody complained that they were struggling to see the game, as many of them still have it burnt into their retinas to this very day. It seems that Konami spent so much time focusing on fixing the brightness issue though, that they had to sacrifice the quality of the soundtrack. No one was divided on this front, as everyone agrees it was one of the worst Castlevania soundtracks to date. There's plenty to keep players busy here though. There's a boss rush mode and also a Maxime mode where players can go through the game as Maxime, who can, say it with me now, TripleJump! Oh, and for you Animal Crossing fans out there, Harmony of Dissonance bizarrely provides players with a room that they can fill with furniture. There's not actually much crossover between the fans of those two franchises, but I bet all 8 of them were pleased with this inclusion. Number 6. Castlevania Circle of the Moon, Game Boy Advance. A launch title for the Game Boy Advance, Circle of the Moon continued utilizing the strong Metroidvania elements of Symphony of the Night, while striving to push the envelope by adding its own ingredients to the recipe. And the result was excellent. The game follows Nathan Graves, whose parents died when they banished Dracula a decade prior. Morris Baldwin helped Nathan's parents with this mighty endeavour, and so he trains Nathan, alongside his son Hugh, in the art of vampire slaying. Camilla, who fans of the Netflix show will recognise, manages to resurrect Dracula, and as Nathan, Hugh and Morris are about to banish him again, the floor crumbles below them and they fall through the castle. Hugh decides to look for his dad on his own, as he hates Nathan because Morris gave the cool vampire hunting whip to him instead of his own son. Boo-hoo! Nathan therefore explores the huge castle map by himself, running into Hugh here and there like a demon-slaying Gary from Pokemon. To change things up from Symphony of the Night, Circle of the Moon includes a magic card system, oh joy, and Nathan can find these cards throughout the game. They fit into one of 2 categories, and only one of each can be equipped at any one time, much like in Order of Ecclesia. There are hundreds of combinations that each change up the style of play, encouraging replayability and experimentation with different setups, and critics loved it. However, as mentioned in our previous entry, the brightness of the game was a common complaint amongst fans and critics. The usual dank, dark Castlevania mood is here, but it made it very difficult to see the screen or clearly make out some of the enemies. This is partly an issue caused by the Game Boy Advance's lack of a backlight, and partly Konami's fault for not compensating for that. Overall though, the game was very well received, and it offered players a huge amount of content. Outside the endlessly replayable main story, there are additional modes with different playable characters, each with unique stats and obstacles to provide a challenge for those looking for more. As much as any other, this was one Castlevania title that truly deserved a port to resolve its only major drawback, the brightness. And thankfully, it received just that, courtesy of its inclusion within 2021's Castlevania Advance Collection. So, save your eyes and play it there. Number 5. Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse, Famicom Disk System, and NES. Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse was the last Castlevania game released for the NES. We'd see Super Castlevania 4 benefit from the improved hardware of the SNES just 2 years later, but Dracula's Curse had to make do with what it had. It may be easy to scoff at this game now, but back in the day, it offered incredible value when compared to many of its contemporaries. Plus, it even managed to improve upon the Castlevania formula in its own way. The game's story was directly adapted by the Netflix TV show, and stars Trevor Belmont and his friends. On his journey to stop Dracula from ravaging Europe with his army of monsters, Trevor stumbles across these companions, and while players can have them all join Trevor, only one can accompany him at any given time. Players can switch freely between Trevor and their chosen chum, and each has their own unique playstyle. Sifa Belnades, the sorceress, has powerful elemental damage. Grant Dynasty, the pirate, can climb walls and change direction mid-jump, and Alucard the Dampier can shoot fireballs and turn into a bat. A Dampier is the offspring of a human and a vampire, by the way, not a vampire stuck out in the rain. The companion switching ability gave players a great reason to replay the title, and so did the branching pathways, each of which led players on a different route to Dracula. The open exploration seen in Simon's Quest is gone, with Dracula's Curse taking on the style of the original Castlevania, while also offering more freedom and less linearity. Dracula's Curse can be brutally difficult, but not unfairly so. If the stiff jumping is an issue, for example, at least there's a pirate Spider-Man to fall back on. If even more assistance is needed, players can always type "help me" at the game's start screen to begin with 10 lives for that extra morale boost. It might feel degrading, but if this was a Wolfenstein game, it'd probably make the player type "I'm a big baby, please help me," so you're actually getting off pretty lightly. The title is definitely showing its age now, but if players want a classic NES Castlevania experience, then this is the best of them. Number 4. Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, Game Boy Advance. Aria of Sorrow was the third Castlevania game to hit the Game Boy Advance, and critics were beginning to worry that Konami was falling into something of a pattern, with previous GBA titles following heavily in Symphony of the Night's footsteps. To counter this, Konami decided to add a double dose of anime. Aria of Sorrow is set in the future in the year 2035. Not long off now, and follows a transfer student, Soma Cruz, who's been sent to study in Japan. Even the character art wears its influences boldly. Although you won't find Soma stuck choosing between the 4 girls in his after-school club, struggling to balance their friendship and happiness as things turn progressively horrific. In this game, Dracula was trapped in a solar eclipse 36 years ago, and the antagonist, Graham Jones, believes he is Dracula's reincarnation, ready to come into power and take over the world. Soma, who discovers he has the power of dominance, wakes up inside the solar eclipse, as you do, where Dracula's castle is located. He's told to find the Master's chambers by a mysterious agent, and thus begins our adventure. Players explore the huge map in the classic Metroidvania style, collecting abilities that allow access to previously inaccessible pathways. Aria of Sorrow is the first game in the series to introduce the tactical soul mechanic. When Soma defeats enemies, there's a chance of them dropping a soul. Soma absorbs the souls and can use them in myriad different ways depending on their category. Bullet souls, for example, act as the game's sub-weapon, and are often some form of projectile which consumes MP upon use. Guardian souls drain MP while active and allow Soma to change into another form or summon a familiar until his MP is depleted. Enchanted souls are passive stat boosts, and ability souls are permanent upgrades that tend to come from bosses and usually grant access to new areas via abilities including sliding and high jumps. This tactical soul mechanic added a collect-em-all aspect to the game, and as the chance of dropping a soul can be very low for some enemies, Konami included the ability to trade souls between 2 Aria of Sorrow cartridges, so friends could help each other to complete their collection. Move over, pocket monsters. The concept of capturing and trading wild animals might be questionable, but harvesting their souls for your collection seems absolutely a-okay to us. Again, we're not here to judge, but God is watching. Aria of Sorrow has an excellent story, tight and varied gameplay, and performed so well with critics that it received a rare direct sequel on the Nintendo DS. Impressive. Number 3. Castlevania Rondo of Blood, PC Engine Super CD-ROM. Rondo of Blood has one flaw, and it's that it wasn't available in the West, except in inferior form, until 2007, over 10 years after its original release in Japan. Clearly it was just so good they wanted to keep it for themselves. Much like previous games in the series, it still had a large focus on action and platforming and an amazing soundtrack, but the title also had a slightly larger focus on narrative and planted the seeds of an open world. The PC Engine Super CD-ROM also allowed for voice-acted cutscenes and detailed graphics. The protagonist is Richter Belmont, who is questing through Dracula's castle to save his love interest, Annette. Richter bumps into Maria Renard, a 12-year-old orphan, and this chance encounter gives players the option to play as Maria instead of Richter. Maria attacks enemies using doves and a whole host of strange sub-weapons, including a tiger kitten, a musical note, a baby phoenix, a dragon whelp, and an egg, Can I offer you one in this trying time? And before you start working out how long it takes to hard boil an egg before it can cause any harm, it's actually the hatching of the egg that causes the damage, not the impact. And this is due to the 9 doves that torpedo out of it. I mean, I'd take psychic damage from just watching that happen, to be honest. Many critics applauded the inclusion of Maria, as she acts as a natural easy mode. She's capable of high damage output, with her doves doubling back like a boomerang, making twice as many hits. She's also more agile, but she does take more damage than Richter, which keeps her balanced. Rondo of Blood is, from a technical standpoint, one of the tightest and most robust early Castlevania games, mainly thanks to the hardware it was designed for. And the graphics, music, and boss fights are some of the best from that era of the franchise. This is a must-play for fans of the series, as well as for those who are simply interested in retro games. And luckily, it's now easily accessible no matter where in the world you live, thanks to the Castlevania Dracula X Chronicles collection. So go on, have a go. Number 2. Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow, DS. Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow is the best handheld Castlevania game out there. Yeah, we said it. As a sequel to Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, it takes everything that made that game good and expanded upon it. Soma returns, and so too does his tactical soul system, with over 100 souls to collect, each boasting a unique ability. There's a large assortment of weapons, and players can upgrade them using specific souls, and collecting multiple souls from the same monster will also improve that soul's ability. Are you sick of the word souls yet? Yeah, well, with the huge combination of souls, weapons, and abilities, combat in a Castlevania game has never quite been as varied as it is here. Dawn of Sorrow could have even clinched the number 1 spot if it weren't for one thing: the forced and clumsy inclusion of the Nintendo DS stylus. Throughout the title, players must learn new magical seals, which are shapes that must be traced on the screen by the player in order to open doors and defeat some bosses. Players will be nearing the end of a hard-won battle, only to be prompted to quickly draw a magical seal to finish them off. If the player traces the shape incorrectly, the boss will not be killed, and will instead regain some health. This may be fine early on, when players only have to trace a rough V shape, but later on the shapes get far more complex, and a bit of panicked artistry can mean the difference between victory and defeat. Having to go from using the buttons on the DS to quickly grabbing the stylus is awkward at best. The stylus is used in a few other ways, like to destroy ice blocks, but these instances are so rare and clunky that they'll make you wish it just wasn't utilised at all. Outside of this gimmick though, the game nears perfection. It may not innovate massively from previous handheld Castlevania games, but it's the ultimate execution of the formula that manifested in the next and final game on our list. Dawn of Sorrow has all of the beloved extra modes from the previous handheld games: a boss rush mode, additional playable characters, and multiple endings. In fact, our writer isn't ashamed to admit that he thought he'd completed the game on his first playthrough, before going through it a second time and finding out that he'd actually received the bad ending, and there was actually still a large portion of the game to play, if only he'd pay more attention to the story. Sadly, there is, at the time of writing, no current port of Dawn of Sorrow, likely due to pesky touch controls. But if you still have a DS lying around, it is worth experiencing the heights that the franchise managed to reach before it was so cruelly abandoned.
Number 1. Castlevania Symphony of the Night, PlayStation and Sega Saturn. This is the title responsible for the Castlevania half of the Metroidvania subgenre, the title that created the template for Castlevania games to follow, and the title named by many as one of the best video games of all time. We know that you Castlevania fans saw this one coming a mile away, but there's a reason the number 1 spot is so obvious. It's just that flipping good.
Symphony of the Night's story follows directly from Rondo of Blood. Alucard rises from a very long power nap to discover that Richter has disappeared and that Dracula's castle is back. In searching the castle, he finds Richter, who claims to be the master of the new castle. Alucard then discovers that Richter is being controlled by a servant of Dracula, and from there, the story flips on its head, literally, as the entire castle turns upside down. This means the developers had to make sure that every level functioned both right side up and upside down, which really is quite the achievement.
Given the story was already extremely engaging, we might have forgiven the game if the gameplay had some pitfalls, but gosh darn it, they managed to get both so right, as Symphony of the Night also paved the way for the fluid combat that future Castlevania games enjoyed. Alucard can wield a large collection of weapons, use magic and sub-weapons, and summon familiars. He can also learn to turn into a bat, a wolf, or mist, which are all forms that Dracula takes in the original Bram Stoker novel, which we have not read. Again, books are for nerds.
As though that weren't enough, Symphony of the Night also brought RPG elements to the Metroidvania formula via character stats. Players gain XP for defeating enemies, eventually leveling up, which increases Alucard's strength, constitution, intelligence, and luck. These vitals affect how hard Alucard hits, and how hard he can get hit, as well as item drop rate, critical hit chance, and more. The system helped players feel a sense of progression through the game, even after defeating common enemies over and over again. Also, if players use Richter as their name at the start of the playthrough, then Richter from Rondo of Blood will replace Alucard as the playable character.
It's difficult to find many flaws in Symphony of the Night without coming off as petty, as near enough every aspect of the game is polished to perfection. Unlike some of the other highly rated Castlevania games on our list, this one stands the test of time and is also easily playable on most systems today, so there's really no excuse for not playing it, and we mean that. Well, what are you waiting for? There are vampires to defeat, get on with it!